his rough hands no longer expected to touch anything tender. After losing his wife and daughter, Elijah only knew the silence of the desert and the echo of his solitary steps. The rain of tears had dried his eyes, leaving only cracks in his heart, like earth split by the relentless sun, until dark eyes looked at him from the broken fence, small hands clutching a bronze medallion. A girl lost between two worlds, and in that unexpected encounter, the desert whispered promises of life once again. If this story has touched your heart like rain touches the desert, give us your like. Each one is a flower that makes this tale bloom in the souls of other solitary wanderers. And now, share with us. How do you think this story will end, between the silent cowboy and the girl with the medallion? Your voice is part of the wind that shapes this desert of emotions. Dawn filtered through the mountain cracks like liquid gold spilled over the horizon. Arizona, 1885. The previous night's storm had left the air clean but heavy, charged with promises that Helena didn't yet understand. Her small fingers clutched a frayed blanket, her only protection against the cold that preceded the desert's relentless heat. 6 years of life, and she already knew the salty taste of fear. Helena huddled even closer against the broken fence. The scent of wet earth reminded her of something distant, a previous life that dissolved in her memory like sugar in water. The cacti, spiny sentinels of dawn, cast elongated shadows over the reddish earth. It had been hours since the train had departed, leaving her in a new world, harsh and unknown. When she saw the rider approaching, her heart stopped for an instant. He was a figure silhouetted against the bleeding sky, tall upon a mahogany-colored horse. Helena held her breath. The man's eyes, sunken beneath the brim of his worn hat, seemed to carry the weight of many winters. "Tô perdida, cowboy. Me ajuda." The words came out in childish Portuguese, mixed with the Spanish she had learned on the ship that brought her to America. Tears threatened to overflow her dark eyes. Elijah Ward remained motionless, as if that girl were a mirage created by the rising sun. Helena perceived in him an ancient sadness, a pain she recognized without understanding it. When the man dismounted, he did so with the slowness of one unsure of what he sees. "Are you lost, little one?" he asked in rough but comprehensible Spanish. The silence stretched between them, like an invisible rope. Helena nodded, unable to explain how she had arrived there, how her mother had placed that bronze medallion around her neck before disappearing into the port crowd, how she had traveled hidden, following whispered instructions. "Look for your aunt in Arizona. She will take care of you." When the cowboy's calloused hand extended toward her, Helena took it, not out of trust, but because the desert offered no alternatives. The contact was rough but firm, like the bark of trees that grew by the river in her homeland. The man lifted her onto his horse with a smooth movement, and Helena felt herself rising above the world, leaving on the red earth a part of herself she would never recover. The ranch appeared on the horizon like a mirage of wood and stone, a small but dignified place with fences twisted by time and a low-roofed stable. For Helena, accustomed to the narrow, dark spaces of the ship, it seemed like a palace in the middle of nowhere. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but dense, as if words were unnecessary before the desert's immensity. Helena clung to the saddle, feeling that each step of the horse took her further from everything known and closer to a future as vast and mysterious as the blue sky stretching infinitely above their heads. Elijah Ward's cabin smelled of leather, bitter coffee, and solitude. Helena remained at the threshold, motionless, observing that foreign space like one gazing at a submerged world. The floorboards creaked under the cowboy's weight, who moved with the economy of gestures proper to one accustomed to living alone. "You can stay until—" Elijah's words hung suspended in the air, incomplete. Helena understood, until someone claimed her, until her aunt appeared, until fate decided what to do with a Brazilian girl lost in the Arizona desert. That first night, lying on a straw mattress covered with mended sheets, Helena listened to the desert sounds filtering through the woods. Cracks. The distant howl of coyotes reminded her of the street dogs of Rio de Janeiro. She closed her eyes and tried to remember her mother's face, but found only fragments, the gleam of a gold earring, the whisper of a lullaby, the jasmine scent that always accompanied her. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. It wasn't the first time she cried without making noise. She had learned to do so on the ship, where crying could betray her presence. Her fingers sought the bronze medallion hanging from her neck. It was a simple object, with the worn relief of a bird with extended wings. Her only inheritance, her only link to the past. In the room's penumbra, shadows danced on the walls like restless ghosts. Helena thought perhaps they were the spirits of those who had loved and lost, condemned to wander between two worlds, just as she felt now, neither from here nor there, suspended between fading memories and an uncertain future. Dawn found her with open eyes. She had slept little, but a deep instinct urged her to rise before the sun. In Brazil, with the domestic service, she had learned that rising early was a duty, not a privilege. She slipped out of the room with a cat's caution, her bare feet barely grazing the wood. The kitchen was empty. A black iron stove dominated the space, cold and silent. Helena felt an ancient impulse, almost forgotten, to be useful, to earn her place. With precise movements for her short age, she searched for wood, arranged it carefully, and after several attempts managed to light a timid fire. She found eggs in a basket and prepared them clumsily, as she had seen the cook do so many times in the house where her mother served. When Elijah entered the kitchen, he stopped short. Helena watched him, fearing his reaction. The cowboy's face, weathered by sun and marked by deep lines, remained impassive. Only his eyes, of a faded blue like old fabric, revealed something resembling surprise. There were no words of thanks or effusive gestures. Only a brief nod, almost imperceptible. Helena interpreted it as approval, and for the first time since leaving Brazil, she felt that perhaps she could find a place in this arid and strange world. After breakfast, Elijah took her to the stable. The scent of hay and animals invaded her senses, vaguely reminding her of the street markets of her homeland. The cowboy showed her how to brush the horses, how to speak to them in low voices to calm them. His instructions were brief, almost laconic, but precise. Helena absorbed every word, every gesture, like thirsty earth under rain. At dusk, sitting on the worn porch, she watched the horizon tinge with orange and purple. The desert, which in the morning had seemed threatening, now revealed itself beautiful in its wild desolation. In the distance, a family of coyotes crossed the plain. Helena thought that she too was a kind of coyote, solitary, adapting to survive in a hostile but fascinating territory. Elijah sat beside her, offering her a cup of warm milk. Their hands brushed when taking the container, a fleeting contact that left an invisible mark. The silence between them was no longer that of strangers, but of two souls recognizing each other in their shared solitude. That night, Helena's crying was softer, briefer. The bronze medallion rested on her chest like a talisman connecting past and present. Outside, the wind whispered secrets in a language she didn't yet understand, but that someday, perhaps, would be as familiar as the mother tongue that was beginning to fade in her memory. The first week at the ranch passed with a rhythm dictated by the sun and the basic needs of desert life. Helena learned to recognize the silent language of that place, how the wind changed before a storm, how lizards hid when the heat became unbearable, how the silence of midday had a different density from the silence of night. The water well became her favorite place, a circle of worn stones with a wooden wellhead and a bucket, suspended from a rough rope. Each morning, Helena drew water for household tasks, and in that moment, looking at her fragmented reflection on the trembling surface, she felt she could communicate with something deeper than the earth itself. "Agua, agua, me conta segredo," she whispered in Portuguese, like a childish spell. "Agua, agua, me mostra o caminho." Sometimes she thought she saw faces in the water, her mother, unknown people, even her own transformed by years. Other times she only saw reflected clouds, traveling faster in the liquid mirror than in the real sky. It was by the well where she found the courage to truly speak with Elijah for the first time. The cowboy was repairing the wellhead, his precise movements revealing years of practice in being self-sufficient. "Do you have family?" Helena asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of hammer against wood. Elijah stopped his work. The silence stretched so long that Helena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded like stones rubbing against each other. "I did. Wife and daughter. Fever took them 8 months ago." Helena nodded, as if that answer confirmed something she already knew. She offered no condolences or additional questions. Instead, she picked up a piece of wood from the ground and handed it to him. The gesture was simple, but contained everything she couldn't express with words: understanding, respect for others' pain, the silent offer of company without demands. Elijah took the wood, his fingers briefly brushing the girl's. In that fleeting contact there was more communication than in hours of conversation. "Thank you," he said, and Helena knew he wasn't just thanking her for the wood. That afternoon, while helping prepare dinner, Helena found the courage to share a fragment of her own story. "My mother gave me this before leaving me," she said, touching the bronze medallion. "She said it would lead me to my family." Elijah didn't ask why her mother had left her or how she had come so far alone. Instead, he examined the medallion carefully. "It's a condor," he pointed out. "Mountain bird. Flies higher than any other." Helena had never heard of the condor, but the idea of a bird that flew above everything seemed appropriate for what she felt, a creature suspended between two worlds, observing from above, searching for a place to land. That night, for the first time, they dined together at the table, instead of Helena eating alone in a corner. There was no great conversation, but the shared silence had a different quality, as if an invisible thread was beginning to weave between them. Before sleeping, Helena found a small notebook and a worn pencil on her improvised mattress. There was no note or explanation. None were needed. She caressed the blank pages, marveled at the possibility of filling them. In Brazil, she had learned some letters in secret, watching the lessons the patron's daughter received. She had never had something of her own to write on. That night she drew instead of writing, simple strokes representing the well, the ranch, the distant mountains, and in a corner, almost like a secret confessed only to paper, two figures, one large and one small, standing under a radiant sun. The bronze medallion rested on her chest as she slept, lighter than the previous night. Outside, the desert wind sang an ancient melody, a song of resistance and adaptation, of life finding its way among the stones. The day they first visited, Red Hollow, Helena woke before dawn with a knot of anticipation in her stomach. She had never been in an American city. The images she had were fragments stolen from others' conversations: orderly streets, shops with bright windows, churches with steeples that tore the sky. She dressed in the only dress she had, now clean and mended by her own inexpert hands. Elijah had cut her a piece of fabric from an old shirt to repair a tear in the skirt. The result was imperfect, but functional, like everything in her new life. The horse ride was silent. Helena, sitting in front of Elijah, watched how the landscape changed subtly. Cacti became less frequent. Occasional twisted trees appeared, and finally, in the distance, the first human constructions beyond the ranch. Red Hollow wasn't the grandiose city she had imagined. It was a modest collection of wooden buildings arranged along a dusty main street. Still, for Helena, it represented civilization, a nexus with the world beyond the isolated ranch. When they dismounted in front of the general store, she felt the gazes before seeing them, eyes that pierced her like small needles, curious, evaluating, some hostile. Her hand instinctively sought the bronze medallion under her dress collar. "Don't stray," Elijah murmured, a protective hand on her shoulder. The store's interior was a universe of smells and colors after the desert's monochrome: spices, fabrics, tools, candies in glass jars. Helena contained the impulse to touch, everything to absorb with her fingers, what her eyes could barely process. "Ward, I didn't know you had company at the ranch." The shopkeeper's voice, a man with a graying beard and stained apron, sounded like sandpaper. "Special circumstances, Abernathy," Elijah replied, his tone cutting any possibility of more questions. Helena remained close to him while they bought provisions: flour, coffee, sugar, seeds, each item selected with economy of means, as if Elijah mentally calculated every last cent. It was then that she saw her, a young woman dressed with sobriety but with an unmistakable air of education. Her chestnut hair was gathered in an impeccable bun, and her eyes, of an intense green, conveyed intelligence and curiosity. She approached them with determined steps. "Mr. Ward, what a surprise to see you in town." Her voice had the measured cadence of one who had studied diction. "And I see you have company." "Miss Doyle," Elijah nodded, uncomfortable with the attention. "This is Helena." Catherine Doyle crouched to Helena's height, her skirts forming a perfect circle around her. "Delighted to meet you, Helena. I'm the school teacher. Would you like to come someday? We have children your age." Helena looked at Elijah, seeking guidance. The cowboy's face remained impassive, but there was a new tension in his shoulders. "Perhaps later," he responded. "She's still adapting." The teacher nodded, but Helena perceived her disappointment. When the woman walked away, Elijah murmured, "Miss Doyle came from the East 2 years ago. She has different ideas." Helena absorbed this information silently. She had learned that Elijah's unspoken words often contained more meaning than the pronounced ones. Upon leaving the store, a group of men conversed on the corner. Their voices quieted upon seeing Elijah with the girl. Helena felt the tension in the air, thick as molasses. "Is it true what they say, Ward? Did you find the girl wandering alone?" asked one, spitting tobacco onto the dusty ground. "My business is mine, Parker," Elijah replied, his hand again on Helena's shoulder, firm but gentle. "I'm just saying it's strange. A man alone. A girl appeared from nowhere." The insinuation floated in the air like poisonous smoke. Helena felt how Elijah tensed, but his voice remained controlled. "Watch your words." The confrontation was suspended when the sheriff, a corpulent man with a grayish mustache, approached. "Any problem, gentlemen?" The men dispersed, not without first casting meaningful glances. The sheriff studied Helena with undisguised curiosity. "So this is the little one they're talking about. You should stop by my office before you leave, Ward. There are procedures for these cases." The rest of the visit passed under a cloud of tension. In the sheriff's office, Helena had to answer questions she barely understood about her origin, her family, how she had arrived there. She mixed Portuguese and Spanish, confusing the officer. Elijah translated what he could, his rudimentary Spanish straining to build bridges. In the end, the sheriff, evidently frustrated but without clear alternatives, allowed Helena to remain with Elijah temporarily, until relatives appeared or a more appropriate solution was found. The way he pronounced those last words made Helena shrink internally. On the way back to the ranch, the silence between them was different. It wasn't the comfortable silence of previous days, but one laden with worry. Helena understood that her presence complicated Elijah's life, created problems where before there had only been simple solitude. That night, while Elijah smoked on the porch, Helena approached and, without saying a word, rested her head against his arm. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact. She felt how the cowboy tensed briefly before relaxing. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he replied, his voice rough but kind. "The world is what should apologize. To you." Helena didn't fully understand what he meant, but felt something loosen in her chest. While the stars appeared in the night sky, so bright they seemed within reach, she thought of the condor on her medallion. Perhaps someday she could fly as high as he, above the gazes, whispers, and doubts. Days transformed into weeks, with the fluidity of water adapting to each container. Helena discovered that time at the ranch had its own rhythm, dictated by repetitive but never exactly identical tasks: feeding the animals at dawn, collecting eggs still warm from the henhouse, helping Elijah with minor repairs, learning to distinguish edible herbs from poisonous ones. The notebook Elijah had given her became her silent confidant. Each night, by the trembling light of a candle, she drew what she couldn't express with words: the profile of distant mountains, a galloping horse, Elijah's silhouette working in the stable. But more frequently, she drew images that emerged from some deep place. In her memory, a large building with intricate balconies, a garden with bright fruited trees, a ship swaying on turbulent waters. One particularly hot afternoon, while Elijah was repairing a distant fence, Helena found in a forgotten trunk something that would change her relationship with the past: a box of old watercolors, with colors dried but still usable. With the reverence others would reserve for golden treasures, she moistened the pigments and began to give color to her drawings. The deep blue of the ocean she had crossed, the lush green of her native Brazil, the red of the rooftops she vaguely remembered, the golden brown of the desert that was now her home. Each brushstroke was a thread weaving a bridge between two worlds, two lives. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Elijah return. The cowboy remained at the threshold, silently watching how the girl brought her memories to life with colors stolen from time. "You draw well," he said finally, startling her. Helena instinctively covered her work, a protective gesture born from fear of having even her memories taken away. But Elijah's expression wasn't one of disapproval, but of genuine interest. It's Rio," she explained, pointing to the large house with gardens, "where my mother worked." It was the first time she had specifically mentioned her origin. Elijah approached, his boots creaking on the wooden floor, and sat beside her. Carefully, like one who fears breaking something fragile, he took the sheet. "Did your mother work in this house?" Helena nodded, the images flowing now with greater clarity. "For a rich family. The Senora had shiny jewels, and the Senor traveled on big ships." Her words mixed Spanish and Portuguese, creating her own language of exile. "My mother cleaned, cooked, took care of their children." Elijah nodded, processing this information with his habitual economy of expression. "And your father?" he asked finally. Helena lowered her gaze to her, paint-stained hands. "I don't have one, or I never knew him," she paused. "Some said it was the Senor, but my mother said no, that it was a sailor who returned to the sea." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but respectful. Elijah didn't judge, didn't question. He simply accepted the story as it came, fragmented and incomplete. "Why did she send you here?" His voice was soft, almost a whisper, as if he feared frightening the emerging memories. Helena felt something tighten in her throat, a knot of emotions she had kept contained for weeks. She got sick. She coughed blood. Her eyes filled with tears. "She said she had a sister here, in Arizona. She gave me the medallion, said it would help me find her. But on the train, I got scared. There were bad men. I jumped when it stopped for water." Tears now flowed freely down her cheeks. It wasn't just the memory of separation that hurt, but the gradual understanding, now articulated for the first time, that she would probably never see her mother again. Elijah didn't try to dry her tears or offer empty words of comfort. Instead, he took from his pocket a worn but clean handkerchief and offered it to her, a simple gesture that contained more understanding than any speech. "The medallion," he said finally. "Does it have any name engraved? Any clue about your aunt?" Helena shook her head, drying her tears. "Only the bird, the condor." Elijah seemed to reflect, his eyes fixed on the horizon, visible through the window. "There's a family in the South Valley, the Aguirres. They have a ranch with a condor carved at the entrance. It could be—" A flash of hope illuminated Helena's face, quickly followed by a shadow of fear. Finding her aunt would mean leaving Elijah, abandoning this strange security she had built amid uncertainty. As if reading her thoughts, Elijah added, "There's no hurry. We can investigate calmly." That night, after Elijah retired to sleep, Helena took out her medallion and studied it. Under the candlelight, as if she could wrest secrets from it, the condor, with its extended wings, seemed suspended between flight and rest, between freedom and belonging. In her notebook, she drew something new, not a memory, but a possibility. A small but cozy house, with Elijah's ranch in the background and a diffuse feminine figure in the foreground, her imagined aunt, her remembered mother, a fusion of desire and memory. Before falling asleep, she placed the drawing under her pillow, like a childish spell to make dreams come true. The medallion rested on her chest, heavier than ever with the weight of expectations and fear. Outside, an owl emitted its spectral call. Helena wondered if night birds carried messages between the living and the dead, between the present and the absent. If so, what would she tell her mother now? That she was safe, that she had found temporary refuge, or that she feared more than anything in the world losing a home just as she began to build it. The Aguirre Ranch was half a day's ride away, in a valley where the desert yielded ground to more generous vegetation. Helena felt her heart beating against the bronze medallion while Elijah guided his horse along an increasingly green path. They hadn't announced their visit. The cowboy had decided it was better to assess the situation before creating expectations. "What is my aunt like?" Helena asked, breaking the silence that had accompanied them for hours. Elijah adjusted his hat, protecting himself from the sun beginning its descent toward the west. "I don't know the Aguirres well. They're reserved but respected. They have good cattle." It wasn't the answer Helena was looking for, but she understood that Elijah wasn't a man for speculation. The ranch appeared like a revelation, a solid construction of adobe and wood, larger than Elijah's cabin, surrounded by well-maintained corrals and cultivated fields. And just as the cowboy had said, over the main entrance arch was carved the unmistakable silhouette of a condor with extended wings. Helena felt the air leave her lungs. Until that moment, her aunt's existence had been a diffuse possibility, a story told by her mother in moments of desperation. Now, suddenly, it materialized in the form of a concrete home, with smells, sounds, and the promise of blood ties. A woman came out to the porch when she heard the horse approaching. She would be about 40 years old, with black hair gathered in a severe braid and skin weathered by the sun. Her eyes, dark and penetrating, fixed first on Elijah and then on Helena with a mixture of surprise and caution. "Mrs. Aguirre," Elijah greeted, dismounting and helping Helena down. "Excuse the intrusion. I'm Elijah Ward from the Northern Ranch." The woman studied them in silence, her erect posture revealing innate pride. "I know you by sight, Mr. Ward. What brings you here?" Her Spanish accent was pronounced, but her English fluent. Elijah placed a hand on Helena's shoulder, a protective gesture that conveyed both support and presentation. "This is Helena. She comes from Brazil and carries a medallion with a condor identical to your entrance. We believe she might be looking for someone from your family." The woman's expression didn't change, but Helena perceived a sudden interest in her gaze. "Brazil," she repeated, as if the word were a strange taste in her mouth. Helena stepped forward, feeling the weight of the woman's gaze. With trembling fingers, she took out the medallion and held it so she could see it. My mother gave me this. She said it would help me find her sister in Arizona." Mrs. Aguirre approached, taking the medallion between her fingers, with a familiarity that made Helena's heart leap. She examined it carefully, turning it to see the reverse where there was only a mark worn by time. "What was your mother's name?" she asked finally, her voice softer. "Louisa Santero." A flash of recognition crossed the woman's face, but was quickly replaced by an indecipherable expression. "My husband must see this," she said simply, and gestured for them to follow her inside the house. The interior was cool and dark after the sun's glare. It smelled of spices, leather, and something sweet that Helena couldn't identify. The walls were decorated with tapestries woven in geometric patterns and carved crucifixes. It was a home that spoke of ancient traditions and deep roots. An older man was seated at a solid oak table, reviewing what appeared to be cattle records. He looked up when they entered, his eyes the same deep brown as the woman's. "Miguel, these visitors bring something you should see," she said in Spanish, a language Helena understood partially, thanks to its similarity to Portuguese. The conversation that followed was rapid, in Spanish too fast for Helena to follow completely. She watched how Mr. Aguirre examined the medallion with the same intensity as his wife, how they exchanged meaningful glances, how finally the man got up and approached an antique trunk in a corner of the room. From it he took out a medallion identical to Helena's. "This belonged to my sister, Constanza," he explained in heavily accented English. "She left many years ago. To Brazil," the letters said. Helena felt the ground move beneath her feet. Elijah, perceiving her shock, kept a firm hand on her shoulder. "Are you Constanza's daughter?" Mrs. Aguirre asked, now studying Helena's face as if searching for family resemblances. Helena shook her head. "Louisa's, but my mother spoke of an aunt. Here." The Aguirres exchanged another glance, this time with a shade of sadness. "Constanza had a daughter in Brazil," Mr. Aguirre said finally. "Louisa, but she never returned. The letters stopped coming 15 years ago." The silence that followed had the weight of generations separated, of family stories fragmented by distance and time. Helena tried to process what this meant. It wasn't her aunt who lived here, but her mother's uncles. Her family, but more distant than she had imagined. "You are our great niece," Mrs. Aguirre declared finally, her face softening slightly. "Blood of our blood." They invited Helena and Elijah to dinner. The meal was abundant. Roasted meat, beans, warm tortillas. The conversation flowed slowly, mainly between the adults, with Helena absorbing every word, every piece of her family history puzzle. She learned that her grandmother, Constanza, had traveled to Brazil following a coffee merchant she had fallen in love with, that she had had Louisa there, but the man had eventually abandoned them, that the letters spoke of difficulties, of working as a servant in wealthy houses, of the hope of someday returning to Arizona. "She never mentioned being sick," said Mrs. Aguirre, now known as Aunt Teresa, when Helena told them about her mother's cough. "She was always proud," her husband Miguel replied, "like all the Aguirres." At the end of the evening, when the stars already shone, in the night sky, Teresa took Helena's hands between hers. "You should stay here," she said firmly. "Your family, this is your place." Helena looked at Elijah, whose face remained impassive, but whose eyes revealed contained emotion. The cowboy nodded slightly, as if giving her permission to choose. "I need time," Helena responded, surprised by her own courage. "To think." The Aguirres didn't hide their disappointment, but respected her decision. They allowed her to keep her grandmother's medallion along with hers, forming a pair that represented the duality of her heritage. The journey back to Elijah's ranch was as silent as the way there, but with a silence laden with new meanings. Helena felt that her world had expanded and contracted simultaneously. She had found roots, history, blood connections, but had also discovered that home wasn't necessarily where family was. "You can go with them whenever you want," Elijah said finally, when the outline of his cabin appeared in the distance. "They have more to offer you than I do." Helena, cradled by the horse's rhythm and the residual warmth of the day, responded with childhood's simple wisdom. "Sometimes what we need isn't what we think." That night, she drew in her notebook the Aguirre's ranch, with its carved entrance and green fields. But in the foreground, almost like a declaration, she drew Elijah's modest cabin, with its stone well and inclined stable. And between both worlds, a small figure with two bronze medallions, like a personal constellation shining over her chest. The nightmares began 3 days after the visit to the Aguirres. Helena woke screaming, wrapped in sweat-soaked sheets, with fragmented images still reverberating in her mind. A ship swaying violently, water entering through the hatches, her mother coughing blood into a white handkerchief that turned crimson. Elijah appeared at her room's threshold, a silhouette outlined against the hall's dim light. He didn't turn on the lamp or offer empty words of comfort. He simply sat on the edge of the mattress, his presence solid as a rock in the midst of Helena's mental storm. "I was on the ship," she whispered, the words coming out broken. "And my mother. Blood. So much blood." Elijah nodded in the penumbra. He didn't need detailed explanations to understand the night terror. He had been visited by his own ghosts too many times. "Breathe with me," he said simply, taking a small hand between his calloused ones. "In, out, like the wind in the mountains." Helena followed his rhythm, feeling how the panic gradually yielded, like the tide receding after a tempest. When her breathing normalized, Elijah did something unexpected. He began to hum an ancient melody, a wordless lullaby. It wasn't a trained voice, it was rough as gravel, hesitant on some notes, but it contained a tenderness that transcended technique. "My wife sang it to our daughter," he explained in a whisper when he finished. "Her name was Sarah. She was your age when the fever—" He didn't complete the sentence. It wasn't necessary. Helena understood then why Elijah had taken her in, why he had risked his reputation and tranquility for an unknown girl. It wasn't just compassion, it was recognition. A broken soul recognizing another. "Do you think my mother is dead?" Helena asked, the question she had been avoiding since her arrival. Elijah remained silent for a long moment, weighing the responsibility of his answer. "I don't." "No," he said finally. "But wherever she is, she loved you enough to send you away to a safe place." It was a painful but comforting truth in its own way. Helena nodded, her eyes fixed on the window, where the moon projected silver patterns through the worn curtains. "The Aguirres are my family, but I don't know them," she murmured. "And you're not my family, but—" "But," Elijah agreed, understanding what she couldn't express. That night, Helena slept with the door ajar, and Elijah sitting in a chair in the hallway, standing guard against the ghosts that neither of them could fight alone. The nightmares continued on following nights, but with less intensity. Helena began to draw them in her notebook upon waking, exorcising them through art. Frantic strokes of ships tossed by immense waves, diffuse faces of people she had known in Brazil, and always, red, drops of blood, threatening sunsets, her mother's crimson handkerchief. One morning, while they breakfasted in silence, Elijah slid, Across the table, a small object wrapped in a piece of worn cloth. "It was Sarah's," he said simply. "I thought it might help you." Helena unwrapped the package with reverential care. It was a small figure carved in wood, a horse in full gallop, with surprisingly delicate details to have been made with a pocket knife. "I carved it for her when she turned 5, Elijah explained, his voice barely audible. "She said it protected her from bad dreams." Helena caressed the surface polished by years of handling, feeling the tiny marks of absent fingers, the weight of memory in the wood. It was the first true gift she had received since leaving Brazil, and the most significant, precisely because she understood what it represented for Elijah to part with it. "Thank you," she whispered, the word completely inadequate for what she felt. That night, she placed the carved horse next to her pillow, her 2 bronze medallions around her neck, and her drawing notebook under the bed. A circle of protection formed by objects charged with meaning, a shield against the darkness that lurked in the corners of her mind. She dreamed, but not of storms or blood. She dreamed of infinite prairies where wild horses galloped under an impossibly blue sky. In the dream, she recognized her mother riding one of the horses, her black hair waving in the wind like a flag of freedom. She didn't seem sick or sad. She smiled, making a farewell gesture that had nothing tragic about it, but of liberation. Helena woke with tears on her cheeks, but they weren't tears of fear or desperation. They were tears of understanding, of acceptance, of a pain that was beginning, very slowly, to transform into something different. At dawn, she drew the dream with vibrant colors, deep blues for the sky, greens and golds for the prairie, the reddish-brown of the horses contrasting with the ethereal figure of her mother, almost transparent, merging with the horizon's light. When Elijah saw the drawing, he remained silent for a long time, his fingers barely grazing the paper's edge, as if he feared the colors would fade with his touch. "It's beautiful," he said finally, and Helena understood he wasn't referring only to the technique or colors, but to what it represented. The transformation of pain into something that, while still being pain, was beginning to become also memory, legacy, personal history. That day, while they worked together in the garden, they had begun to cultivate next to the well. Helena spoke more than usual, sharing fragments of her life in Brazil, the bustling markets where her mother bought impossibly colored fruits, the songs they sang while washing clothes, the stories she told her about the condor that flew so high it could see the future. Elijah listened attentively, asking occasional questions, building together with her a bridge between past and present, and although neither said it aloud, both felt that something had changed. The nightmares had opened a door that, once crossed, allowed a new form of communication between them. That night, before sleeping, Helena wrote for the first time in her notebook, in childish Spanish mixed with Portuguese, "I think Mama is fine now, and I think I will be fine too." The annual Spring Festival in Red Hollow was the most important event of the year for the entire region. Helena watched it approach with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Preparations began weeks before. Elijah repaired his cart, greased the axles and painted the wheels a bright red that contrasted with the desert's monotony. "Why red?" Helena asked, watching how the brushstrokes transformed the worn wood. "Tradition," Elijah replied with his habitual economy of words. "My father painted the cart for the festival, and his father before him." It was the first time he had mentioned his family beyond his wife and daughter. Helena registered it as a small treasure, another piece of the puzzle that was this taciturn man who had become her anchor in an unstable world. The morning of the festival, Helena woke before dawn. On her bed, she found a package wrapped in brown paper. Upon opening it, she held her breath. It was a dress, not new but carefully mended and modified, of an intense blue like the sky after a storm. She recognized the fabric as part of a dress she had seen in the trunk where she found the watercolors, probably belonging to Elijah's wife. She put it on with trembling hands, marveled at the transformation. It was a bit large for her, but someone, Elijah, Mrs. Aguirre, had added pleats and seams to adapt it to her size. When she came out to the dining room, she found Elijah dressed in his only good shirt, clean and starched for the occasion, and boots polished to a shine. "You look," he began, the words apparently stuck in his throat. "Pretty?" Helena completed, turning to show the dress. "Yes," he nodded, and for a brief instant his face lit up with something resembling a smile, like a desert flower. The road to Red Hollow had never seemed so short. The cart advanced through clouds of golden dust, rocked by the horse's constant trot. Helena felt a bubbling emotion, a mixture of nervousness and joy. It would be her first celebration in America, her first time participating in community life beyond necessary shopping in town. Red Hollow had been transformed. Colored streamers crossed the main street. Wooden stalls offered everything from food to skill games, and a wooden platform dominated the central plaza, where musicians were tuning instruments for the evening dance. The aroma of roasted meat, fresh bread, and caramel sweets permeated the air. Helena instinctively clung to Elijah's hand as they descended from the cart. The gazes found them again, but this time they had a different nuance. It wasn't just curiosity or suspicion. There was something more, perhaps reluctant acceptance or simple accustomedness to their presence. The Aguirres received them at their stall, where they sold cheeses and sweets prepared by Teresa. The woman embraced Helena with a warmth she hadn't shown in their first encounter, admiring the dress and commenting on how it brought out her eyes. "You should spend a few days with us after the festival," Teresa suggested, while offering her a crystallized pumpkin sweet. "Learn some family recipes." Helena nodded, feeling how two worlds were slowly beginning to intertwine in her life: Elijah's ranch, austere but safe, and the Aguirre's family warmth, with their traditions and blood ties. The morning's surprise came when Miss Doyle, the teacher, approached with a group of children from the school. "Helena, would you like to join the children's choir for the midday song?" she asked with a warm smile. "You don't need to know the complete lyrics, you can follow the others." Before she could answer, a freckled boy interrupted. "She doesn't even speak English well. She'll ruin everything." Helena felt her face burn with shame. It was true that her English was rudimentary, learned mainly from Elijah and from her scarce interactions in town. "Thomas Parker, that was rude," Miss Doyle reprimanded, but the damage was done. Helena lowered her gaze, wishing to disappear. It was then that Elijah, who had remained silent as always, stepped forward. "Helena speaks 3 languages," he said, his voice low but clear. "How many do you speak, boy?" The boy stepped back, intimidated by the cowboy's imposing figure. "Miss..." Doyle seized the moment. "Actually, I was thinking we could include a song in Spanish this year, to show our little town's diversity. Do you know any, Helena?" The idea of singing in front of the whole town made Helena's stomach contract with nervousness, but she also felt a spark of pride. She knew songs, many taught by her mother and the other servants on hot nights in Rio. "Yes," she finally responded. "I know one about a bird that flies over mountains." The choir's presentation was the midday central event. The children, dressed in their best clothes, lined up on the wooden platform, Helena among them, feeling simultaneously part of the group and apart, as she had been all her life. They first sang 2 traditional American songs, with Helena following the melody more than the words awkwardly. Then Miss Doyle announced a special surprise and signaled to her. With her heart beating so hard she feared everyone could hear it, Helena stepped forward. She searched for Elijah among the crowd and found him next to the Aguirres, his tense posture revealing his own anxiety for her. She breathed deeply and began to sing. Her voice, clear and pure as spring water, rose over the plaza. "Vuela, vuela, cóndor mío, sobre valles y quebradas. Lleva mi amor en tus alas, a la tierra que dejé atrás." It was a song of longing, of love for the homeland, but also of hope. Helena sang it with all the feeling of her 6 years of life, with all the pain of separation and all the gratitude for her new home. When she finished, the silence was total for an eternal instant. Then, like a wave that finally breaks against the shore, applause erupted. Helena saw tears in Teresa Aguirre's eyes, a broad smile on Miss Doyle's face, and in Elijah something she had never seen before, pure and unreserved pride. The rest of the day passed like a colorful dream. Games where Elijah helped her win a small silver mirror, meals shared with the Aguirres and other ranchers, even a brief dance with Miguel Aguirre on Elijah's shoulders, because she was too small to dance properly. At dusk, when torches began to light for the night celebration, Helena found herself sitting on a log by the river that crossed the town. She was exhausted, but exultant, her mind processing all the day's new experiences. It was there that Parker, the store owner, found her, with a newspaper in hand and a grave expression. "Ward, can we talk? In private," he added, looking at Helena. Elijah shook his head. "Whatever you have to say, you can say it in front of her." Parker hesitated, then extended the newspaper. "This arrived this morning from the east. Page 3. Helena watched how Elijah took the paper, opened it with measured movements, and his face transformed upon reading whatever it contained. "What does it say?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Elijah folded the newspaper slowly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression she couldn't interpret. "It's an advertisement," he said finally. "Someone is looking for a girl who looks a lot like you." Helena's world, so bright and promising just minutes before, seemed to suddenly darken. Fear, familiar as an old friend, returned to her stomach. "Who?" she whispered. "A man named Eduardo Santero from Rio de Janeiro," Elijah replied, his voice carefully neutral. "He says he's your father." The news about the newspaper advertisement spread through Red Hollow like fire in dry prairie. The festival continued, but Helena felt the gazes with renewed intensity. She was no longer just the foreign girl Ward found. Now she was a mystery, an incomplete story that everyone wanted to complete in their own way. Back at the ranch, the silence between her and Elijah was heavy, laden with unformulated questions. Helena kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, where the day's last lights painted the sky purple and gold. The bronze medallion seemed to burn against her skin, a constant reminder of promises and secrets. It was only when they reached the safety of the cabin, with the door closed against the outside world, that Elijah finally spoke. "Do you know this man? Eduardo Santero?" Helena shook her head, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her blue dress, now stained with dust from the road. "My mother never said his name," she replied, the words coming out broken. "She only said that my father was an important man who couldn't recognize me. The advertisement says he's a businessman. Coffee merchant. He says his wife, your mother, died 3 months ago and confessed about you on her deathbed." The tears erupted then, an uncontainable torrent. They weren't just for the confirmation of what she already suspected, that her mother had died, but for the revelation that she had been this man's wife, not a servant, as she had always believed. How much more of her story was a fabrication? Elijah knelt in front of her, his rough hands clumsily drying the tears that ran down her cheeks. "Listen, little one. I don't know what is truth and what isn't, but I know this. Your mother loved you. She sent you away to protect you. That is real." Helena nodded, unable to speak. She clutched the medallion, her only tangible link to a life that seemed increasingly distant and confusing. "What are we going to do?" she asked finally, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah stood up, his silhouette outlined against the oil lamp like an immovable mountain. "For now, nothing. The advertisement doesn't mention Arizona specifically. He's searching throughout the West. We have time to think." That night, Helena couldn't sleep. She took out her notebook and began to draw frantically. Ships, oceans, trains, and finally, a faceless man in an elegant suit, extending a hand toward her across an abyss. Was that her father? The man her mother had hidden, or from whom she had hidden her? Questions spun in her mind like trapped birds. At dawn, when Elijah entered her room with a cup of warm milk, he found her asleep over the open notebook, the pencil still in her hand. Carefully he removed both without waking her, and observed the drawings. His face hardened upon seeing the faceless man, as if recognizing an adversary. The sheriff arrived at the ranch 3 days later. He brought with him an official letter and an uncomfortable expression. Helena watched from the window while the man spoke with Elijah on the porch, their voices too low to distinguish words, but their postures revealing the exchange's tension. When Elijah entered, his face was paler than usual under the sun's bronze. "Eduardo Santero has contacted the authorities," he said without preamble. "He's coming to Arizona. He's hired agents to search every town, every ranch." Helena felt the ground open beneath her feet. The possibility, before abstract, now took concrete, threatening form. "I don't want to go with him," she declared, her voice surprisingly firm. "I don't know him. He doesn't know me." Elijah sat heavily in his chair by the unlit fireplace, rubbing his face with tired hands. "It's not that simple, little one. Legally, he's your father." "You found me. You took care of me." Desperation raised her voice, mixing Spanish and Portuguese in her agitation. "And I have no rights over you," Elijah replied, the crude truth in his words cutting like a knife. I'm just a stranger who picked you up." The words hit Helena with physical force. It was true. In the eyes of the law, of the world, Elijah was nothing to her. Neither father nor legal guardian, just a solitary cowboy who had shown compassion for a lost girl. The following days passed in a state of vigilant anxiety. Helena noticed how Elijah spent more time on the porch, watching the horizon as if expecting to see the agents mentioned in the letter appear at any moment. She also noticed how he had begun to teach her English with greater intensity, correcting her pronunciation, expanding her vocabulary. "You need to be able to express yourself clearly," he explained, "so they'll listen to you." One afternoon, while Helena practiced writing her name in English, they heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. It wasn't the sheriff, but Miguel Aguirre, riding at full speed. "Ward," he called from his horse, not bothering to dismount. "They've been at our ranch. 2 men from the city asking about a Brazilian girl. We told them we didn't know anything, but they'll be back. With the sheriff, probably." Elijah nodded, thanking the warning with a silent gesture. When Miguel rode away, he turned to Helena, who had heard everything from the door's threshold. "We have to make a decision," he said, his voice grave, "and it has to be yours." That night, sitting at the kitchen table with maps spread between them, they discussed the options. They could flee, head further west, toward California, or north, toward the mountains. They could wait and face Eduardo Santero, try to negotiate some kind of agreement, or they could accept the inevitable and prepare for separation. "I want to stay with you," Helena declared, her eyes fixed on Elijah's, "but I don't want you to have problems, for them to call you a child thief." The wisdom in her words, so improper for her 6 years, made Elijah feel a knot in his throat. This girl who had crossed an ocean and survived the loss of everything familiar, now worried about protecting him. "I'm no coward," he replied. "If you want to stay, we'll fight." Helena reflected, her hand unconsciously playing with the 2 bronze medallions that now hung together from her neck. "I want to meet him," she said finally. "Know who he is, if he's good, if my mother loved him." It was the most difficult and also the most courageous decision, to face the unknown, the possibility of a new life, without fleeing or hiding. Elijah nodded, a quiet pride reflecting in his eyes. "Then we'll do it right," he declared, with dignity. The next morning, Elijah saddled his best horse and headed to Red Hollow to inform the sheriff that Helena was with him, that she was the girl Eduardo Santero was looking for, and that they were willing to meet with him when he arrived. They wouldn't hide the truth, but they wouldn't surrender it either without first ensuring she would be well. While Elijah was absent, Helena took out her notebook and drew something she had never attempted before, a self-portrait. She drew herself standing between 2 worlds. On one side, Elijah's ranch, the well, the horses, the simple but honest life she had known in Arizona. On the other, an imagined mansion in Brazil, elegant but cold, a faceless father waiting, and she in the center, with her 2 medallions, like the condor of her family emblem, ready to fly but still unsure of where to direct her wings. Eduardo Santero's arrival in Red Hollow was an unprecedented event for the small frontier town. 2 weeks after the sheriff sent a telegram confirming Helena's whereabouts, a private carriage crossed the main street, raising clouds of golden dust that the evening sun transformed into an almost magical haze. Helena and Elijah waited on the sheriff's office porch, she in her blue dress carefully washed and ironed, he in his Sunday shirt and hat clean of dust. The girl felt her heart beating in her throat, her fingers clutching the bronze medallions as if they were a talisman against the unknown. The carriage stopped. A man descended first, tall, of strong build, in a dark suit that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. It wasn't Eduardo Santero, but his lawyer, as he would soon introduce himself. Behind him stepped down a middle-aged woman, dressed with the elegant severity of a governess or lady companion, and finally, him. Eduardo Santero was shorter than Helena had imagined, but his presence was undeniable. He wore a light suit, impeccable despite the journey, and a hat that he removed upon descending, revealing black hair, with silver receding hairlines combed with precision. His face of defined features and olive skin showed the signs of time, but preserved an austere beauty. His eyes, of the same deep brown as Helena's, scanned the street until they found her. Time seemed to stop. Helena felt Elijah's hand on her shoulder, firm, reassuring. The man who claimed to be her father looked at her with an almost painful intensity, as if trying to reconcile a mental image with the reality before him. He took a step toward them, then another. He stopped at a respectful distance. Helena, he pronounced her name with an accent that instantly transported the girl to Rio's streets, to bustling markets, to a past fading in her memory. She didn't respond. Words had evaporated, leaving only a buzzing in her ears. This man, this elegant stranger who pronounced her name as if it belonged to him, claimed to be half of her origin, her blood, her destiny. It was the sheriff who broke the moment, inviting them all into his office. The space, normally ample by the town's standards, seemed to shrink with the presence of so many people and so many contained emotions. "Mr. Santero has traveled from very far," the sheriff began, clearly uncomfortable with his role as mediator, "and he has presented documents that prove his paternity." Eduardo nodded, not taking his eyes off Helena. "My wife, Luisa, confessed our daughter's existence to me shortly before dying," he explained, his English fluent but marked by Portuguese accent. "We had been married barely a year. She told me she had sent Helena to America to look for her maternal family, but feared she had gotten lost along the way." Each word was a revelation for Helena. Had her mother married this man? Why keep her secret only to reveal her existence at the end? "I have certificates," Eduardo continued, now addressing Elijah. "Birth, marriage, letters from Luisa explaining everything, and witnesses in Rio who confirm that Helena lived in our house, although not as my daughter." The implication hung in the air. Helena had lived as a servant in the house that should have been her home. Elijah, who had remained silent until then, spoke with the calm of one who has carefully considered each word. "Helena has been with me for almost 4 months. She has adapted. She has found family here too." He gestured toward the Aguirres, who had been summoned as known relatives. "It's not a simple decision." Eduardo seemed surprised, as if he hadn't considered there might be resistance to his claims. "I thank you for caring for my daughter, Mr. Ward. You will be generously compensated, of course." It was then that Helena found her voice, emerging from some deep place within her. "I'm not a horse," she said in careful, clear English. "You can't buy me." An astonished silence followed her words. Eduardo looked at her as if seeing her truly for the first time. "Of course not, my child," he replied in Portuguese, his voice softening. "You are my blood, my heir." "Why now?" Helena asked, mixing English, Spanish, and Portuguese in her agitation. "Why not before?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Eduardo looked at his lawyer, then at the woman accompanying him as if seeking guidance. "It's complicated," he said finally. "There are circumstances. Business. My first wife, who died 3 years ago. Luisa was her lady companion before—" He interrupted himself, apparently conscious that he was revealing more than he intended. Helena absorbed every word, every inflection, building a story that was beginning to make sense. A rich man, an inappropriate relationship with an employee, a hidden pregnancy, a girl raised in the shadows. "I want to repair my mistakes," Eduardo continued. "Give you the place you deserve, the education, the opportunities that should have been yours from the beginning." His words sounded sincere, but Helena perceived something more beneath the surface. Guilt, certainly, but also calculation, as if she were an equation he had finally decided to solve. "I need time," she declared, surprising everyone with her firmness. "To think." Eduardo seemed about to protest, but his lawyer placed a hand on his arm, a subtle but effective gesture. "Of course," he conceded finally. "We'll stay at the town hotel. Take the time you need to adapt to the idea." When they left the sheriff's office, the sun was beginning to set, tinting Red Hollow with copper hues. Helena walked between Elijah and Teresa Aguirre, as if suspended between two worlds, two possibilities of future. "What will you do?" Teresa asked in a low voice, when they were far from alien ears. Helena looked toward the carriage that was moving away, carrying that stranger who claimed to be half of her origin. "I don't know," she replied honestly. "I need to understand who he is, who I am to him." That night, in Elijah's cabin, Helena couldn't sleep. She went out to the porch and found the cowboy sitting in his usual chair, smoking in silence while contemplating the stars. "If you want to go with him, I'll understand," Elijah said, not taking his gaze from the night sky. "He's your father. He can give you things I never could. Helena sat at his feet, resting her head against his knee as she had taken as custom in recent weeks. But would I be happy? She asked, real doubt in her voice. How can I know? Elijah extinguished his cigarette, his movements deliberate like everything he did. You can't know, he replied frankly. Life doesn't offer guarantees, little one, only options, and the courage to face the consequences. Helena nodded, finding wisdom in his simple words. The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind of silence only possible between people who know each other deeply. I want to talk to him, she decided finally. Alone. Really know him, not just the words he says for others. Elijah nodded, a glint of pride in his eyes. Tomorrow, I'll take you to town, he promised, and I'll wait outside as long as you need. When Helena finally went to sleep, she drew a new image in her notebook. 3 figures in a divided landscape. On one side, Eduardo Santero, with his elegant suit and his world of privileges. On the other, Elijah Ward with his dignified simplicity and modest home. And in the center, herself, holding in each hand one of the bronze medallions, as if weighing 2 possible destinies. The drawing offered no answers, but posed the right question. Not who had more right over her, but where she could truly belong. The day of decision dawned with a clean, bright sky, as if nature itself wanted to offer clarity for the crucial moment ahead. Helena woke before dawn, a habit acquired at the ranch that had already become an integral part of her being. She dressed carefully, choosing the blue dress that symbolized for her her life in Arizona, but combing her hair with the silver brush Eduardo had given her the day before, a small bridge between 2 worlds. Elijah was already in the kitchen when she came out of her room, preparing a simple but abundant breakfast. Eggs, tortillas, coffee for him, and milk for her. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind of silence only possible between people who have learned to communicate beyond words. He'll come at noon, Helena said finally, breaking the silence. Elijah nodded, his face impassive as always, but his eyes revealing a complex mixture of emotions. Have you decided? He asked, his voice rough but kind. Helena looked out the window, toward the desert extending beyond the ranch, toward the distant mountains that seemed to change color with the changing light. Yes, she replied simply, but I want to go to the well first. The well had been her refuge since the first day, the place where she found peace and clarity amid confusion. As they walked there, Helena observed everything with renewed intensity. The path stones, the cacti blooming against all odds, the inclined stable that Elijah never finished repairing because there were always more urgent tasks, small everyday details that had woven themselves into the fabric of her life without her noticing. By the well, Helena drew fresh water and drank directly from the bucket, savoring the mineral purity that no city water could match. Then she sat on the stone edge, her feet swinging without touching the ground. Thank you, she said, looking at Elijah, who remained standing a few steps away, for everything. The cowboy slightly inclined his head, accepting her gratitude with the silent dignity that characterized him. It has been an honor, little one. The simplicity of his words contained more truth than all the elaborate speeches Eduardo could offer. Helena felt her eyes moisten, but they weren't tears of sadness but of recognition, of appreciation for what this taciturn man had meant in her life. In the distance, they heard the sound of hooves approaching. It wasn't noon yet, but Eduardo Santero was a businessman, accustomed to controlling circumstances by arriving earlier than expected. Helena stood up, shaking the dust from her dress with gestures that were already automatic. From her pocket, she took out the small carved well that Elijah had given her the day before, caressing its contours with her fingers. The carriage stopped in front of the cabin. Eduardo descended alone, without his lawyer or governess, dressed more simply than on previous days, as if trying to adapt to the ranch environment. He advanced toward them with measured steps, stopping at a respectful distance. "Good morning," he greeted, his eyes alternating between Helena and Elijah. "I hope I'm not arriving too early." "The desert wakes with the sun," Elijah replied, his voice neutral but not hostile. Eduardo nodded, accepting the hint about the differences between their worlds. Then his attention focused completely on Helena. "Have you decided, my daughter?" Helena tightened the small carved well in her hand, feeling its comforting solidity. She looked toward the horizon, where Arizona's sky merged with the earth in a perfect line, then at Elijah with his silent dignity, and finally at Eduardo with his eyes so similar to hers. "Yes," she replied with a clarity that surprised both men. "I want to know Brazil, know my heritage. But this place," she made a gesture encompassing the ranch, "is also part of me now." Eduardo frowned, confused. "What exactly are you saying?" Helena breathed deeply, as Elijah had taught her when fear threatened to overwhelm her. "I'll go with you for 1 year," she declared. "I'll learn what you can teach me about my mother, about Brazil, about business. But then I'll return here for another year, and so on, until I'm older and can decide where I want to live permanently." An astonished silence followed her words. This wasn't the answer either of the two men expected. "That's unusual," Eduardo said finally, visibly disconcerted. "Like me," Helena replied with a small smile. "Neither totally from here nor totally from there. I need both worlds to be complete." Elijah looked at her with a quiet pride, worth more than 1,000 words of approval. This girl who had arrived in his life like a desert mirage now showed wisdom that transcended her short age. "And if I say no?" Eduardo asked, his tone more curious than threatening. "If I insist you come with me permanently?" Helena held his gaze without wavering. "Then I'll choose to stay." "Here?" she replied simply. "And you'll lose the opportunity to know me." Eduardo remained silent, evaluating this unexpected daughter who combined Louisa's determination with his own pragmatism. Finally, a reluctant smile appeared on his face. "You are truly my daughter," he said, with what seemed like new respect in his voice. "Negotiating terms like a businesswoman." He turned to Elijah, studying him with new eyes. "Mr. Ward, would you be willing to accept this unconventional arrangement?" Elijah looked at Helena, whose face showed a mixture of hope and determination. "If it's what she wants, I'll support it," he replied, his voice rough but firm. "This will always be her home." Eduardo nodded slowly, processing this unexpected solution. "We would need to establish dates, regular communication," he began, his negotiator's mind already structuring the details. "And visits from the Aguirres," Helena added. "They're my family too." For the first time since his arrival, Eduardo laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his severe face. "I see you've thought of everything," he said, extending his hand toward her. "Very well, my daughter. I accept your terms." Helena took his hand, feeling the softness of a life without manual labor, so different from Elijah's calloused hands that had been her first contact with this new world. Then, without releasing Eduardo, she extended her other hand toward Elijah. For a perfect moment, she held both men's hands, a living bridge between two worlds, two possibilities, two parts of herself that no longer needed to be in conflict. 3 years later, a train stopped at the small station near Red Hollow. Among the passengers who descended, a girl of about 9 years old stood out, dressed in an elegant travel suit that combined European refinement with details that spoke of Brazil, a blue butterfly brooch, a silk scarf with tropical motifs. Helena Santero Ward, as she now called herself, walked along the platform with the confidence of one who knows her place in the world. Her English was now fluent. Her Spanish had improved through letters exchanged with the Aguirres, and her Portuguese had been refined during her stays in Rio. Elijah waited for her next to his cart, freshly painted red for the occasion. Beside him, the Aguirres, whose relationship with Eduardo had evolved to the point where Miguel now supervised a small investment by the Brazilian in local cattle. "Elijah!" Helena exclaimed, running toward him, with childhood's abandon that she still preserved, despite the formal education she had received in Brazil. The cowboy crouched to receive her in an embrace, his normally stoic face transformed by a genuine smile. He had aged in these years, new gray streaked his hair, but his eyes had a life that had been absent when Helena first met him. "Welcome home, little one," he said, though she was no longer so little. Teresa embraced her afterward, exclaiming about how much she had grown, while Miguel nodded with paternal approval. To everyone's surprise, Eduardo had scrupulously fulfilled the agreement, sending Helena punctually each year, maintaining regular correspondence with Elijah and the Aguirres, and even occasionally visiting Arizona, gradually developing mutual respect with the man who had saved his daughter. As the cart advanced toward the ranch, Helena took from her pocket the small carved well, worn by years of being held as a talisman. In her other hand, the two bronze medallions shone under the desert sun. "Do you still draw?" Elijah asked, noticing the drawing notebook peeking from her luggage. Helena nodded, her eyes bright. "I'm painting a book," she explained, "about a girl who travels between two worlds. Papa says we could publish it someday." The word Papa no longer created confusion. Everyone understood she referred to Eduardo, while Elijah occupied an equally important but different place in her heart, a figure who didn't need labels to be fundamental. Upon arriving at the ranch, Helena ran immediately to the well, her sacred place. She leaned over the wellhead, observing her reflection in the clear water. She was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived years ago, lost between two worlds. Now she belonged to both, or perhaps more precisely, she belonged to herself. "Agua, agua, me mostra quem sou," she whispered in Portuguese, a private ritual she had maintained through the years. The water returned the image of a girl with Brazil's sun on her skin and the desert's strength in her eyes. A girl who, like the condor of her medallion, had learned to fly between mountains and oceans, between past and future, between memory and hope. Helena smiled at her reflection. The desert's whisper no longer brought fear but promises, and she, with roots on two continents and wings of her own, was ready to listen.